The cool, damp air of England wraps around you first. Not the scent of myrrh and papyrus, but of wood smoke, damp earth, and the distant earthy tang of livestock. The soft, rhythmic creak of timbers, perhaps from a nearby inn, or an old market stall, settles into a gentle lullaby. You are almost asleep, limbs sinking into the comforting weight of whatever soft surface cradles you, your breath slowing to the rhythm of the unseen night. But before sleep takes you completely gently, something shifts. The light changes, not golden and dim like desert lamps, but a pale silver glow filtered through leaded glass, hinting at a distant moon. Then the sound of faint, almost imperceptible rustle of heavy fabric, followed by the soft clink of something metallic. You open your eyes, and somehow you're in a great hall. Not a grand, bustling hall, but one hushed by the late hour, its vastness now intimate. Tapestries depicting hunts and allegories hang heavy on the stone walls, their colors muted by time. A single brazier glows in the center of the room, casting dancing shadows that twist and stretch like secrets. You feel the rough texture of wool against your cheek, perhaps a blanket or a cushion. Your feet are bare, and the cold of the flagstones beneath them is a gentle shock. The wind outside whistles softly through unseen cracks, a mournful ancient sound that speaks of vast open country beyond these walls. A distant church bell tolls once deeply, its echo fading into the quiet. This is the Tudor age, not as presented in flamboyant pageants, but as it truly existed, raw, unvarnished, and alive with the ghosts of what once was. And then footsteps. Not soft and deliberate like a queen on a boat, but firm with a slight, almost imperceptible drag. A shape approaches from the shadows, surprisingly tall, even regal, despite the slight stiffness in his gait. His silhouette is broad, almost imposing even in the dim light. He is dressed in what appears to be fine velvet, though it hangs a little more loosely than one might expect. "Ah, there you are," a voice rumbles rich and deep, yet softened by a weariness that only immense experience can bestow. "I was beginning to think you'd never stir." He stops, and you discern the faint, intriguing scent of old leather wood polish and something indefinably regal. His eyes, though shadowed, hold a spark of intelligence, even mischief. You blink. "Where am I?" You manage your voice a whisper. He chuckles a low, gravelly sound. "Where indeed? You are my dear friend, precisely where I once was. In the very heart of my own memory, walking these halls again. And it's late or early, depending on your perspective. The best time I found for stories that truly matter." A pause. The air, surprisingly, doesn't carry the lingering scent of ancient ailments, but a cleaner, sharper note, as if time has scrubbed away the unpleasantries. "I am Henry," he states the name, landing not with a thundering pronouncement, but with a quiet weight, as if acknowledging a long, complex legacy. "Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of Ireland, defender of the faith, for a time anyway. And now merely a rather experienced storyteller." He gives a wry, knowing smile. "I've never truly liked silence, you see. Too many thoughts, too many voices from the past, all clamoring for attention, and too many moments when I was forced to simply exist." A heavy leather-bound book, its pages thick with intricate script, brushes past your hand. It smells faintly of old ink and beeswax. He gestures with it. "Come stand with me," he invites, his voice warm, yet with an undertone of gentle command. "Feel the cold of these stones. Imagine the draft that could whip through these very halls in winter, enough to set your teeth chattering, no matter how many furs you draped upon yourself." You find yourself rising, the sensation of wool and cold flagstone fading as you follow his lead. He moves towards a tall, narrow window, its glass panes rattling almost imperceptibly with the passing breeze. Outside, the world is a monochrome landscape of rooftops and slumbering fields beneath the moon. "I asked this night to be quiet." He murmurs, his gaze distant so we can converse. Not about battles or the tiresome machinations of Parliament, but about the rhythms of life, the weight of a crown, and the peculiar nature of memory. "You see, this isn't merely history as I recall it. This is history as I lived it, and now I invite you to live it with me. You say nothing, but a sense of calm begins to settle over you. His voice, the subtle creak of the ancient hall, the whispers of the wind, a new rhythm is forming, pulling you deeper into the past. This isn't a history of simple triumphs or neat narratives, he continues, his voice reflective. It's a history of ambition, yes, and of a king who perhaps tried too hard to shape the world to his liking. A history of constant striving and of learning to survive choices that even now raise an eyebrow or two amongst polite society. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound comes from the dark corners of the hall, perhaps a mouse or merely the house settling. Henry glances towards it, a faint knowing smirk on his lips. Ah, yes, the palace pets, he remarks dryly, always present, always observing, and always reminding one that even a king shares his dwelling with creatures who care little for royal decrees or delicate sensibilities. He leans against the window frame, the silver light illuminating the strong lines of his face, free from the ravages time would later inflict. I don't mind sharing my story with you, he says, his eyes meeting yours steady and clear. Not the version etched on monumental tombs, the breathing one, the laughing one, the one who believed a woman could be a queen and then changed his mind rather spectacularly, the one who at times worried far too much and at others far too little. Another breeze brushes past, carrying a hint of distant meadowsweet. It is a reminder that this night isn't quite real, or perhaps it is more real than any other. So breathe in. Let the ancient hall enfold you gently. Let Henry guide the words, because tonight you are walking between worlds with a king who once ruled one, and a consciousness that remembers everything. This is Sleep Among Titans. And you, dear listener, are exactly where you're meant to be. If your eyes are still open, welcome. If they're starting to close, that's perfect too. The story will wait. It always has. And if this night brings you calm, I'd love to know. Leave a whisper in the comments. Or simply subscribe. Leave a lantern lit so the next dream can find you. Ah, my dear listener, you may have grown accustomed to the image of an aged, weighty monarch, but allow me to paint you a picture of another Henry, the boy I once was. In my youth I was the very pride of the court, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair as red as a roaring fire and eyes that gleamed with mischief. A man, I dare say, capable of setting young ladies' hearts aflutter and making rival kings think twice. Can you imagine the sheer vibrancy of it all? The clash of colors, the scent of fresh-cut rushes and newly pressed silks. Henry gestures with a sweep of his hand as if conjuring the scene before you. You find yourself walking with him, the flagstones beneath your bare feet, now replaced by the soft plush velvet of a royal corridor, the sounds of distant bells and muted activity filtering through the heavy walls. The air is surprisingly clean without the musky scent of later years, carrying only faint hints of wood smoke and polished beeswax. I was no mere handsome face, you see. He continues, a touch of playful pride in his tone. I was an athlete of no small renown. Jousting, I was a master. Picture me thundering down the lists, lance poised, the crowd roaring as I struck my opponent square. Here, try this. He pauses by a heavy, ornate wooden table, upon which rests a short, blunt lance, clearly a practice piece. It looks surprisingly heavy. Go on, lift it. Feel the weight of what it took to unseat a man in full armor. You reach out your fingers, closing around the smooth, solid wood. It is indeed heavier than you expected, requiring a surprising amount of effort to even lift slightly. Henry watches your effort with an amused glint in his eye. Rather heavy, isn't it, or archery? Just look at that distant target no bigger than a serving plate. Now watch how it's truly done. He mimes drawing a bow, his form still perfect. Perhaps you'd like to draw an imaginary bow with me. Feel the tension in your arms, the focus in your eye. You might feel your muscles tense as you mimic the action. Good. And then the release. Pure exhilaration. You might nod or hum in acknowledgement, perhaps even trying to emulate his stance. Tennis. I could outplay any opponent until they were gasping for breath, and you alive and well would no doubt have been most impressed. And it wasn't merely brawn. My mind, too, was as sharp as a newly honed blade. I was originally destined for the church, you see, had my elder brother Arthur not regrettably passed from this mortal coil so prematurely. Thus I possessed a fervent passion for theology, philosophy, astronomy, and indeed music. I composed hymns and love songs, some of which I dare say are still sung to this very day. Here, hum a little tune with me. Henry hums a simple, ancient-sounding melody inviting you to join. It's calming yet subtly melancholic. You'd find them quite catchy, as the modern folk might say. He pauses by an alcove where a lute rests on a velvet cushion. He lightly plucks a string, a soft, resonant note hanging in the air. I spoke Latin, French, and a smattering of Italian. A true Renaissance man, I flatter myself, with every sense eager for knowledge and refinement. Ah, and my appetite. Even in my youth I possessed a formidable one. But back then, it merely fueled my jousts, my long hunts, and the vigorous dances that often lasted until dawn. As you walk, Henry's presence is captivating. He moves with a lithe grace, a surprising lightness for a man of such stature, a stark contrast to the later descriptions. The hall around you is empty, yet filled with the echoes of his words, the ghosts of forgotten laughter. My first marriage to Catherine of Aragon was at its outset a most solid alliance built on respect and, dare I say, a rather warm affection. She was a woman of sharp intellect, steadfast resolve, and I truly believed she would bless me with the robust male heir needed to secure the Tudor throne. Such was the fervent desire of every king. Can you imagine the sheer weight of such expectation, dear friend? You might nod or sigh softly, a quiet acknowledgement of the burden. He leads you to a sunlit courtyard where the scent of freshly turned earth and blooming roses replaces the indoor air. A sense of peace, almost idyllic, hangs in the air. And then the shift began. He says, his voice now a little softer, a hint of something deeper beneath the light-hearted tone. Not a sudden thunderclap, but a slow, almost imperceptible turning. It began with an accident, a jousting accident in the year 1536. My horse, God rest its soul, stumbled, and I was thrown pinned beneath its weight. I lay there quite insensible for a full 2 hours. A mere blink in the grand tapestry of my reign, yet it changed everything. He runs a hand over an imaginary saddle, a distant look in his eyes. The injuries to my leg, though seemingly minor at first, never truly healed. They became chronic ulcers, deep weeping sores that no poultice, no prayer, no amount of royal will could truly mend. From that day forward, the pain became a constant companion, a nagging whisper always present. It robbed me of the joy of the hunt, rendered riding almost impossible, and transformed the very dances that were once my passion into a form of subtle torture. Have you ever felt a persistent ache, a dull throb that never quite leaves? You might grimace or offer a quiet yes. Imagine that for decades. He sighs a sound that even now carries a hint of ancient weariness. And so the old habits began to shift. The vigorous exercise diminished while the feasting, alas, became more indulgent. Food became a solace, a distraction from the gnawing pain and the creeping frustration. My girth, I confess, began to expand slowly at first, then with rather alarming speed, until I scarcely recognized myself in the polished silver mirrors of my own court. As he speaks, the crispness of the air in the hall seems to subtly thicken. The distant sounds of the palace grow fainter, replaced by a more immediate, earthy presence. You are no longer in the youthful Henry's memory, but drifting towards the inevitable. I have already shared with you, dear friend, the grim details of my later years when I became, as I so eloquently put it, a rather imposing armchair. But now, standing here on the other side of that great divide, I can confess that the scent of those chronic ulcers, that particular aroma of decaying flesh, it was truly distinctive. My courtiers, bless their subtle souls, developed a curious habit of easing away mid-conversation. And the ambassadors, those hardened veterans of diplomatic intrigue, often conducted their meetings whilst clutching perfumed cloths to their faces. The Renaissance equivalent, I suppose, of tactical air support. Henry's tone is dry, detached, as if discussing a peculiar scientific phenomenon. My physicians, those poor, earnest souls, tried every concoction and incantation known to man. Honey rose oil, the usual desperate concoctions. Even cauterization, burning the wounds, closed, a rather effective method for ensuring one remained wide awake during treatment, I assure you. And the daily lancing. I often wondered if the constant rotation of new physicians was due to the sheer tedium of the task, or perhaps the psychological toll of such proximity to royal oozing. High turnover, I suspect. He pauses, a deep, resonant breath filling the space. My diet, you ask? Ah, that was perhaps a work of art in its own right. Gallons of red wine daily, meat of every conceivable variety enough to feed a small army, or at least a very ambitious guild of butchers. I often jested in my later years that my very bloodstream must have been 60% Cabernet. Now looking back, I suspect that figure was a conservative estimate, and the indignity of having my food pre-cut for me, that my friend was the final definitive sign of decline, when even the simple act of lifting a turkey leg became an aerobic activity. The grandeur, the sheer volume of it all was a spectacle in itself. The air around you has subtly changed, becoming heavier, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible tang that you quickly dismiss as ancient dust. Henry's voice, though still clear, now holds a deeper resonance, a slight drag that wasn't there before. My temper, alas, grew rather unpredictable. I became, I'm told, a man whose primary foreign policy tool was rage. One moment I might weep openly for the memory of my beloved Jane Seymour, a raw, heartfelt grief. The next I might accuse a courtier of treason for blinking too loudly. My court lived in a constant state of psychological whiplash. My mood swings were legendary. A mere frown and my advisors would deduce either severe constipation or imminent war. Humorous, perhaps, in retrospect. Less so for those living through it, I imagine. He leans heavily against an unseen piece of furniture, a long, drawn-out sigh escaping him. This physical decline, as I came to understand, was not just an inconvenience. It was a cage. Inactivity worsened everything: my circulation, my mood, my already hostile digestive system. And when you are a monarch, your health, dear listener, becomes everyone's problem. Entire days were scheduled around how far I could be rolled, wheeled, or carried. Court ceremonies were shortened. State functions were planned to keep the king seated for as long as possible. If the throne room had possessed a treadmill, it would have been purely symbolic, or perhaps put to use powering a spit roast. And yet no one dared to speak the obvious truth that the most powerful man in England was quite literally weighed down by his own choices. He gestures around the dimly lit hall, the shadows seeming to deepen with his words. You see, for all the pageantry, the power, the pronouncements, the daily reality was often quite messy. A human thing, after all, even for a king. Especially for a king, perhaps. For when one commands so much, one also accumulates so many burdens. And some of those burdens, alas, cling to you even into the twilight of your days. From the confines of my ailing body, my thoughts, I must confess, often drifted to grander schemes, to the very fabric of my kingdom, and to the eternal question of succession. Henry begins, his voice now taking on a more serious yet still conversational tone. You see, a king's legacy, much like a good vintage, relies on a steady flow. And for a Tudor king, that meant a male heir. A rather simple concept, one might think, but oh, the complications it brought upon me. And upon others. He gestures with a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his hand, inviting you to follow him through another less physical journey. You sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere around you. The air grows heavier, not with the tang of the decaying, but with the palpable weight of political intrigue and unresolved matters. The silence of the hall feels less comforting, more watchful, as if the very stones are listening. My first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, as I mentioned, began with such promise. He continues, a note of wistfulness in his voice. She was the widow of my dear brother Arthur, a dutiful wife, a learned woman, and for many years my closest confidant. For 2 decades we were as one. But time, my friend, has a cruel way of revealing inconvenient truths, and the truth in this case was rather stark. We had no living male heir. He pauses, and you almost feel the pressure of the expectation that weighed upon him. Only a daughter marry a good girl devoted to her mother, but a girl nonetheless. And a kingdom, you understand, yearned for a son. A direct male line. A guarantee against civil strife, against the very chaos my father had worked so tirelessly to put down. The concept was simple enough in my mind, a clear succession. He explains, a touch of impatience entering his tone. But the path to achieve it, that, alas, was paved with theological arguments, diplomatic headaches, and rather stubborn popes. I sought an annulment, You see believing my marriage to Catherine to be against God's law, a union cursed, due to her prior marriage to Arthur. The book of Leviticus, it was quite clear on the matter. He coughs a dry, almost cynical sound. The Pope Clement VII, however, seemed to have a rather convenient lapse of memory regarding Scripture, influenced as he was by Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. A powerful man, Charles, with rather a lot of troops at his disposal and a distinct lack of interest in my marital woes. Politics, as always, trumped piety. He paces slowly, a phantom rustle of his younger, more energetic stride. This was not, as some would suggest, merely a king's infatuation with a younger woman. He states a touch of defensiveness creeping into his voice. Though Anne Boleyn, I grant you, was a woman of undeniable charm, wit, and a rather captivating spirit. No, this was about the security of England, about the Tudor line, about preventing a return to the Wars of the Roses. A king must always prioritize his kingdom even when it involves, shall we say, a certain amount of inconvenience for those involved. The result of this papal obstinacy, you might recall, was rather significant. He says, a wry understatement. I severed ties with Rome, declared myself supreme head of the Church of England. A rather bold move, I concede. One does not simply discard centuries of religious tradition without causing a considerable stir, but the alternative to leave my kingdom without a male heir was simply unthinkable. He stops, and you imagine the hushed murmurs, the fearful glances of those in his court as this unprecedented decision was announced. And then came Anne. He says, a complicated mix of fondness and bitterness in his tone. My second queen, the woman for whom I overturned a kingdom, defied a pope, and some might say lost my soul. She gave me Elizabeth, a clever girl, much like her mother. But again, not a son. His voice hardens. Anne, alas, proved to be disappointing in that crucial regard, and her enemies at court, ever vigilant, were quick to point out her supposed failings. Her ambition, her wit, her inability to produce a male heir, all became evidence against her. It was, you understand, a matter of great expediency. He pauses, and a faint, chilling gust of wind seems to sweep through the hall, carrying a whisper of old sorrow. Her end was swift and necessary. The charges, whether true or fabricated, served their purpose. A queen, it seemed, could be discarded as easily as an inconvenient scroll if she failed in her primary duty. And so the axe fell. A rather messy business, all told, but one that cleared the path for the next attempt at securing my line. You find yourself instinctively shiver despite the warmth of the brazier. My third queen, Jane Seymour, he says, his voice softening perceptibly, almost tenderly. Ah, Jane, the one true love, perhaps. The quiet one, the gentle one. The one who finally gave me Edward, a son, my longed-for heir. He sighs, a deep, contented sound, yet tinged with a familiar melancholy. But happiness, it seemed, was a fleeting thing in my life. Jane passed soon after Edward's birth from childbed fever. A tragedy, a profound loss, and a stark reminder that even a king cannot escape the cruel hand of fate. I mourned her deeply, truly. She was the one who truly understood my plight, my need for an heir. A rare soul. He walks to a heavy oak door, tracing its intricate carvings with a finger. My subsequent marriages, I confess, were less about love and more about political necessity, or simply finding a suitable consort to guide my young son. He explains a pragmatic weariness in his voice. There was Anne of Cleves, the Flanders mare, as I so uncharitably called her. A political alliance that proved to be a rather unfortunate miscalculation. Her portrait, painted by Holbein, was far more flattering than the lady herself. Henry shakes his head, a wry smile on his lips. Imagine my surprise meeting her in person after all the glowing reports. A rather awkward encounter, you can well imagine. A marriage quickly annulled, mercifully so. You might suppress a chuckle picturing the royal disappointment. Then Catherine Howard, a young, vivacious girl. Perhaps too young, too vivacious. She brought a certain lightness to the court, a youthful energy. But her past, alas, proved to be a rather inconvenient burden. And discretion, it seems, was not among her virtues. Another execution, another shadow cast upon my reign. A king, you see, must maintain a certain image of moral rectitude, even when his personal life resembles a particularly elaborate game of musical chairs. And finally, Catherine Parr. He says, his voice settling into a tone of quiet contentment. My sixth and final queen. A widow herself, a woman of great sense, piety, and patience. She was less a lover, more a nurse, a companion, a stepmother to my children, and a calming presence in my increasingly turbulent later years. She survived me, you see. A feat in itself, and for that, I am eternally grateful. He turns from the door facing you squarely. These marriages, these grand political maneuvers were not just personal affairs. Each was a strategic act, an attempt to secure my dynasty to ensure the stability of England. A king cannot afford the luxury of purely romantic notions when the fate of a nation hangs in the balance, though I admit some of them involved more passion than others, and some of them I concede were rather more messy than I would have preferred. One must adapt, you see, even a king. He paces again, the phantom drag in his step more pronounced now. The dissolution of the monasteries, you might recall, was another rather significant undertaking intertwined with my break from Rome. It wasn't merely about wealth, though the church's vast lands and coffers were certainly a welcome addition to the royal treasury. No, it was about power, about consolidating my authority over the realm spiritually as well as temporally. Those monks, you see, those quiet, contemplative souls, they held a loyalty to Rome that I could not abide. A king cannot tolerate divided loyalties within his own borders. And so the great abbeys, those ancient bastions of learning and piety, were dismantled. Their lands seized their treasures, melted down their very stones used to build new palaces, new fortifications, new symbols of my newfound authority. He stops by the brazier, warming his hands. A rather efficient process all told, though I dare say there were many a weeping monk who did not appreciate my newfound zeal for reform, and countless ordinary folk who found their familiar rituals disrupted, their charitable support gone. A necessary evil, I told myself, for the good of England, for the true faith. A sudden chill seems to permeate the grand hall, carrying with it a sense of the brutal realities of his reign. And then, of course, there was the matter of dissent, the pilgrimage of grace, a rebellion of some scale fueled by discontent over the religious changes, over the dissolution of the monasteries, over the very direction of my rule. I dealt with it, as I dealt with all challenges to my authority, with unwavering resolve, and with considerable force. It taught me quite painfully that even loyalty has its limits, and that absolute power, while intoxicating, also demands absolute vigilance. Many paid the ultimate price for their defiance. His voice is flat, devoid of emotion, a man recounting an unpleasant but unavoidable duty. My inner circle, too, was a revolving door of sorts. Trusted advisors, loyal friends, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, all at one point or another found themselves on the wrong side of my favor, or my mood. A king, you see, must be ruthless, especially when he suspects betrayal, or simply a lack of total understanding. He shrugs a heavy, weary motion. One must, as a king, project an image of unshakable strength. Henry says, his voice now quieter, almost conversational, as if confiding a secret. Even when one's legs are throbbing and one's stomach is protesting the last gallon of wine, this relentless striving, this constant balancing act between perceived weakness and absolute authority began to wear upon me. The strain, I believe, contributed greatly to the ailments that later consumed me. The constant battle for an air for legitimacy, for absolute control. It takes its toll, my friend. It truly does. He walks towards a heavy velvet curtain, its folds deep and shadowed. You see, for all the grand pronouncements, the majestic portraits, and the divine right I so steadfastly claimed, the daily reality was often quite human and quite brutal. A constant struggle to hold on to the reins of power, to shape a kingdom to my will, and to silence the whispers of dissent, both within my court and within my own increasingly burdened mind. A king, you learn, rarely truly rests, even when his body demands it most. He turns, his face shadowed by the dim light, but his eyes gleaming with a profound, almost weary wisdom. And so the stage was set for my later years. A king increasingly isolated by his own decisions, consumed by his own physical decay, yet still clinging fiercely to the reins of power. The boy who was once the pride of England had become a man scarred by the battles he fought both within his realm and within himself. A rather dramatic progression, wouldn't you agree? And one that I assure you was far from over. Now let us turn from the great events, from the wives and the rebellions, and consider the quieter mysteries of my reign. Henry murmurs, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a confidence. The daily life within these very walls, when a king's health or lack thereof cast a long, curious shadow. You see, even in decline, the image of the glorious king had to be maintained. A most exhausting theatrical production, I assure you. He leads you from the great hall through a series of smaller, more intimate chambers, the echoes of your footsteps soft on the rush-strewn floors. The air here is warmer, more enclosed, scented faintly with old lavender and the lingering aroma of beeswax candles. You notice small curious details: a discarded embroidery hoop on a window seat, a half-finished game board on a low table hinting at lives lived just beyond the royal gaze. My portraits, of course, continued to depict me as virile and broad-shouldered. He says, a dry chuckle escaping him, with eyes that one hoped conveyed divine purpose rather than the weary resignation of a man who had been sitting in his chair so long his armor felt fused to him. My tailor, poor soul, struggled to keep pace with my ever-expanding frame. One report, I believe, claims my last suit of armor required a waist measurement of 54 inches. One could, as I often quipped, house a small courtier inside one of my sleeves by then. He gives a heavy sigh. Behind the velvet and jewels I was rotting slowly publicly and with a considerable budget. Courtiers avoided standing too close. Servants, I suspect, prayed not to be assigned foot duty, a most unenviable task, I assure you. He pauses by a heavily carved bed, its four-poster frame draped with faded crimson velvet. The bed even now seems immense. This was not the golden age of refrigeration, you understand. He continues, his voice taking on a detached, almost scientific tone, as if discussing a complex engineering problem. Embalming methods were rudimentary. They would stuff the corpse with spices and wrap it in layers of cloth, rather like a royal lasagna, hoping that cinnamon and cloves would overpower the scent of decay. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Despite their best efforts, my form began to leak. Slowly at first, then alarmingly. A mixture of bodily fluids, I am told, seeped through the coffin, causing discomfort, confusion, and eventually widespread nausea. It got so bad that during my funeral procession to Windsor, the coffin reportedly emitted a dark stain and smell so potent that it startled the horses. And in one now infamous account, it even attracted stray dogs. Dogs, my friend, licking the drippings from the former head of the Church of England. Not, I assure you, how I had imagined my legacy being honored. You find yourself wincing slightly, perhaps even taking a discreet breath through your mouth. The image is vivid, and the underlying humor almost too dark to fully appreciate. The coffin, alas, had been sealed hastily. He continues, a note of exasperation in his voice. Royal urgency, you see, overrode craftsmanship. It swelled from internal gases and allegedly cracked. The Tudor version of Tupperware, I suppose. Everyone involved tried to keep a straight face. Mourning nobles walked beside the oozing coffin with the dignity of people pretending they couldn't smell anything, and no one, absolutely no one, brought it up in conversation afterward. It's not every day a monarch's corpse makes headlines centuries later for the way it malfunctioned. But then again, I was never one to do things quietly. Not in life, and certainly not in death. He moves on, ushering you into a small, quiet study filled with scrolls and a heavy leather-bound globe. The air here is calmer, less fraught with the echoes of physical decay. My chronic pain, you see, contributed greatly to my emotional volatility. Henry admits, his voice now quieter, almost vulnerable. One minute I was weeping over my dead wife, Jane Seymour's memory. A genuine, profound grief, I assure you. The next I was accusing someone of treason for blinking too loudly. My court lived in a constant state of psychological whiplash. Servants learned to interpret the tilt of my eyebrows the way sailors read clouds before a storm. He's frowning, that's either constipation or war. A rather exhausting existence for all involved, I should think. He gestures to a sturdy wooden chair near a large, unlit fireplace. Sit, if you will. Rest your feet. A luxury I was often denied in my later years, ironically. Medical historians, I'm told, now suspect that alongside my physical ailments, I may have suffered from untreated depression, chronic pain-induced irritability, and possibly even head trauma from that fateful jousting accident in 1536. But in 16th century England, the go-to treatment for a bad mood was prayer leeches or blaming the French. Unfortunately, being king meant no one could tell me to take a break. Instead, advisors smiled nervously and agreed with whatever I said. Some even praised my divinely inspired fury, which I assure you was a nice way of saying, "We'd like to keep our necks, please." He leans against the fireplace mantel, his gaze fixed on the cold hearth. The results were messy. Dozens of courtiers were exiled, imprisoned, or executed simply for falling out of favor during one of my mood hurricanes. Even my longtime friend and Chancellor Thomas More was not spared, proving that my inner circle was shaped more like a revolving door. By January of 1547, everyone in the royal court could see the end coming, except notably myself. I was in every way falling apart, but you couldn't legally say so. Under Tudor law, predicting the king's death was treason, which made my royal physicians the most anxious, overqualified actors in history. He shifts, a heavy sigh escaping him. I was confined to bed, not just bedridden, but bed-dwelling, as some put it. I hadn't walked in weeks, hadn't ridden in years, and spent my final days ruling England from beneath a mountain of embroidered cushions and questionable decisions. My legs were swollen, my breathing labored. My appetite was reduced well by Tudor standards anyway. I was still eating like someone who didn't realize his will was about to become the most important document in the country. Despite my obvious state, no one dared utter the word dying. Courtiers developed a whole glossary of euphemisms. His Majesty is resting deeply. His Majesty is in a reflective mood. The king is simply digesting vigorously. He gestures with a dismissive wave. Even my doctors tiptoed around the subject. One physician reportedly declared, "His Majesty shall recover, God willing." A safe statement, vague, non-committal, and with divine backup. Meanwhile, said Majesty was drifting in and out of consciousness, probably hallucinating about roast goose and Protestant diplomacy. But even in my decline, I still had paperwork to finish. I signed documents, amended my will, appointed a regency council for my 9-year-old son Edward, who would soon be handed the kingdom and a debt the size of France. These weren't the majestic final acts of a noble ruler. They were scribbled commands from a very sick man whose court pretended he was just having a moment. Everyone around me knew the truth. Servants, courtiers, even the rats in the palace floorboards probably sensed something shifting, but still they waited, because the King of England couldn't die until it was safe to say so. And at that stage, no one wanted to go first. Henry walked slowly towards a grand, intricately carved chest, running his hand along its dark wood. As January dragged on, I hovered somewhere between lucidity and royal delirium. My body was shutting down, but my mind still had policies to bark out people to snub and a country to pretend I wasn't dying in front of. The denial was thick, possibly thicker than my ankles. I gave no formal confession, no emotional farewell, no cinematic final words. Instead, I issued instructions, edits to the will, tweaks to the Regency Council, and the usual paranoid rearranging of power players just in case any of them got funny ideas after my eventual and definitely not impending death. He pauses, a faint, rueful smile on his lips. Most notably, I finalized the succession plan. My sickly 9-year-old son Edward would take the throne, flanked by a hand-picked group of advisors. These men, it should be noted, had roughly the loyalty and backstabbing tendencies of a barrel full of Tudor eels. He opens the lid of the chest, revealing faded documents and a few heavy, tarnished coins. I also ordered that my tomb be completed, a grand structure I'd been planning for decades. Spoiler, it never got finished. For all my micromanaging and power hoarding, the thing that outlasted me was paperwork. As for religion, I managed to keep things impressively ambiguous. England was still Protestantish, but not too Protestant. Just Protestant enough to upset Rome without committing to anything doctrinal. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of muttering something under your breath and walking away quickly. Even in my final days, I refused to acknowledge just how close the end was. When priests asked if I'd like to make peace with God, I dodged them like a man avoiding jury duty. Henry closes the chest with a soft thud. One account suggests I eventually whispered, "All is lost." But even then, the court wasn't sure if I meant my soul, the kingdom, or just a misplaced turkey leg. Meanwhile, the palace operated under a strict, "don't say he's dying" policy. If anyone was caught using phrases like last rites or funeral preparations, they were swiftly removed, not for disrespect, but for ruining the illusion that England's most powerful monarch wasn't dissolving in his own bed. He walks you towards a window looking out onto a dark courtyard. In the grand tradition of royal drama, you'd expect me to deliver a stirring deathbed confession, a Shakespearean monologue about sins, regrets, and the 6 wives I either married, murdered, or misplaced. Instead, you got silence. Or worse, administrative clarity. There were priests at my bedside, yes, but they were mostly ornamental. I, who had rebranded the entire Church of England just so I could annul a marriage and flirt with theology on my own terms, was suddenly very quiet about my spiritual affairs. No dramatic plea for forgiveness. No humble repentance. No sorry about that whole beheading your mother chat with my daughter Mary. Perhaps I thought I had nothing to confess. After all, this was a man who believed God had personally endorsed his every decision, even the messier ones. He leans against the window frame, his gaze distant. From my point of view, I hadn't failed morally. I had just been chronically misunderstood by papists and wives with annoying survival instincts. According to one report, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer arrived in time to ask if the king still trusted in Christ. I, barely conscious, supposedly squeezed his hand, a gesture open to interpretation. Was it affirmation? Was it a muscle spasm? Was I simply annoyed the Archbishop hadn't brought wine? That squeeze would be the closest thing I ever gave to a final confession. For a man obsessed with control, it's telling that my final hours were filled not with reflection, but with paperwork delegation and vague gestures at spiritual matters. While other kings died repenting, I died reallocating. And while I had once described myself as the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, I now faced death with no more ceremony than a nod and a hand twitch. Divine authority apparently did not include an exit interview, but maybe that was the most Henry way to go. No apologies, no weeping monks, just the slow, steady decline of a man who always preferred the sound of his own laws to the echo of his conscience. He turns from the window, and you notice the faint, almost transparent quality of his form, as if he is a memory made visible. And so passed Henry VIII with no dramatic final words, no poetic closure, and absolutely no indication that I thought anything had gone wrong. When I finally stopped breathing on January 28, 1547, the room didn't erupt into mourning or solemn proclamations. It sort of paused, then stood around awkwardly, then quietly panicked. Because here's the thing, it was illegal to declare the king dead without very specific authorization under Tudor law. To suggest the monarch had died even if he was visibly deceased was technically treason, which meant everyone in the room suddenly became deeply interested in pretending I was simply resting, possibly very deeply and permanently. He chuckles, a mirthless sound. Doctors, courtiers, and clergymen all stared at each other, waiting for someone to blink first. No one did. There was no press release, no moment of national mourning, no trumpets, just the heavy silence of men thinking, well, now what? Eventually they agreed to say nothing for several days, not out of respect but strategy. The succession still needed to be managed. The council assembled, and most importantly, the 9-year-old heir Edward informed that he now technically owned everything in England, including some very angry neighbors. In the meantime, my body remained in Whitehall Palace, still king in title, but now more biologically aspirational. Ministers quietly arranged my affairs while pretending I was still unavailable, which wasn't a lie, just a spectacular understatement. And while no one spoke the word, dead palace staff began making preparations with all the subtlety of a Shakespearean farce. Mourning clothes were quietly ordered, seals were altered. Some opportunists probably started dusting off family trees to prove they were technically 12th cousins to the boy king and thus deserved land. Henry shakes his head slowly. Even foreign ambassadors weren't told right away. Diplomats from France and the Holy Roman Empire were still negotiating with courtiers who smiled through clenched teeth, hoping no one noticed the faint scent of royal decomposition wafting through the velvet drapes. The entire nation was being led by a man who, as far as the law was concerned, was still alive, just unusually quiet, not currently moving and about to need a very large coffin. Once I was officially, if not immediately, dead, my royal handlers faced a new and urgent dilemma: what to do with the body. And unfortunately for everyone involved, the body had opinions of its own, mostly involving decomposition. He stops standing before a shadowy corner of the hall, and the air around you grows colder, almost damp. Let's be blunt, the man was enormous. I weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and not a trim, symmetrical 300 more, of a melting, noble pudding shape. My body was riddled with infections, ulcers, and years of aggressive Tudor eating. So naturally, it began breaking down faster than expected. Much faster. In the chilly halls of Whitehall Palace, servants and embalmers scrambled to preserve the king. But this wasn't the golden age of refrigeration. Embalming methods were rudimentary, consisting of stuffing the corpse with spices and wrapping it in layers of cloth like a royal lasagna. The hope was that cinnamon and cloves would overpower the scent of decay. Spoiler, they didn't. The cold intensifies, and you might feel a faint shiver travel down your spine. Despite their best efforts, the body began to leak, slowly at first, then alarmingly. A mixture of bodily fluids seeped through the coffin, causing discomfort, confusion, and eventually widespread nausea. It got so bad that during the funeral procession to Windsor, the coffin reportedly emitted a dark stain and smell so potent that it startled the horses, and in one now infamous account, attracted stray dogs. Yes, dogs licking the drippings from the former head of the Church of England, which is probably not how I imagined my legacy being honored. To make matters worse, the coffin had been sealed hastily. Royal urgency overrode craftsmanship. It swelled from internal gases and allegedly cracked the Tudor version of Tupperware it was not. Everyone involved tried to keep a straight face. Mourning nobles walked beside the oozing coffin with the dignity of people pretending they couldn't smell anything, and no one, absolutely no one, brought it up in conversation afterward. It's not every day a monarch's corpse makes headlines centuries later for the way it malfunctioned, but then again, I was never one to do things quietly, not in life, and certainly not in death. He moves away from the shadowed corner, and the cold recedes, slightly replaced by a lingering, almost phantom dampness in the air. There's something deliciously poetic, or brutally ironic, about where I ended up. Henry reflects a dry, almost bitter amusement in his voice. Not in Westminster Abbey with the other great kings, not in some towering mausoleum of Tudor marble. No, the man who broke with the Catholic Church, who dissolved monasteries, and who declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, was buried in a humble vault beneath the floor of St. George's Chapel. Almost like an afterthought. I was placed next to my true love, Jane Seymour, the one wife who gave me a male heir, and died before she could disappoint me. He gestures to the very flagstones beneath your feet. And that's it. No towering monument, no golden tomb. Just a slab on the floor that for over a century didn't even bear my name. It was only in the Victorian era that someone added an inscription. Until then, I was resting in unmarked anonymity, just a few feet beneath tourists' boots and royal ceremonies. Here lies the man who once thundered across Europe with papal bulls in one hand and a turkey leg in the other. The man who decapitated 2 wives, dismantled centuries of religious tradition, and rewrote the spiritual map of England. Now buried like a moderately successful merchant. The irony is rich, and yet somehow appropriate. After all the grandeur, the power, the ceremonies, and the political tantrums, it's almost fitting that my final destination was quietly humble, even accidental. No glorious tomb commissioned during life, no elaborate effigy, no towering altar to my glory. Just a lead-lined box under a chapel floor, a fading memory in the company of Jane, and eventually Charles the Fern, whose own death was, let's say, not subtle. For all my desire to dominate history, I ended up in a shared grave with minimal decoration and maximum foot traffic. Henry pauses, a long, reflective silence falling between you. The sounds of the ancient hall seem to settle, the faint creaks and murmurs becoming part of the quietude. And so, dear listener, he concludes, his voice a soft, final murmur, you have walked with me through the strange, messy, and ultimately human reality of my decline. A king laid bare not by enemies, but by the relentless march of time, and the rather inconvenient realities of a body that, despite all power, refused to obey my will. The great events, the wives, the break with Rome, these were the grand pronouncements of my reign, the thunderclap that echoed across Europe. Henry states, his voice now taking on a more distant yet still deeply contemplative tone. But a king's life, and indeed a kingdom's true story, is not merely told in the roar of battles or the pronouncements from the throne. It is woven into the quieter rhythms of daily life, into the struggles and joys of the common folk whose world I shaped often without them even knowing it. And it is in these contrasting lives, these unseen struggles, that one finds the true weight of a crown. He gestures with a sweep of his hand, and the heavy ornate hall around you begins to dissolve, replaced by a softer, more vibrant scene. You find yourself standing on a cobbled street damp with morning dew. The air is sharper here, alive with the sounds of a bustling Tudor town just beginning to stir. The rhythmic clatter of a distant hammer, the lowing of cattle, the faint, sweet scent of baking bread mixed with the pungent aroma of wood smoke and damp straw. Ahead, half-timbered houses lean companionably into the street, their upper stories almost touching. This is not the palace, but the vibrant, often harsh reality of Tudor England for the majority of its people. "Observe, dear friend," Henry murmurs, his voice resonating with an almost wistful quality. He is no longer the youthful, vigorous king, nor the infirm old man, but something in between, a timeless observer. My decisions, those grand pronouncements from Westminster, rippled outwards, affecting every soul in my realm, from the lowliest peasant to the wealthiest merchant. Take, for instance, the matter of religion. My break with Rome, born of my quest for an heir, was hailed by some as a divine liberation, by others as a sacrilegious act. But for the ordinary man and woman it meant a rather bewildering shift in their daily spiritual landscape. He points to a small, thatched-roof church nestled at the end of the street, its bells now ringing with a crisp, clear chime. Imagine, if you will, the changes. For centuries, their lives revolved around the familiar rhythm of the Catholic Church. Latin Mass, the veneration of saints, the pilgrimages to holy shrines, the comforting presence of the local monastery. Then suddenly I decreed that all should be in English. The Bible, once locked away, became accessible to those who could read, or at least be read to. The images of saints once revered were sometimes defaced or removed, and the monasteries, those ancient bastions of charity and learning, were dissolved. Their lands, seized, their bells melted down. For many it was a profound disorientation, a stripping away of the familiar. What did they make of it, do you think, the farmers, the weavers, the innkeepers? Did they truly understand the theological nuances, or simply mourn the loss of familiar comfort? You might shake your head slightly, imagining the confusion and quiet fear such changes would have wrought, the familiar sense of continuity broken, and the lives of women. Henry muses, his gaze softening as he watches a woman in a simple kirtle hang laundry on a line, a child clinging to her skirts. Beyond the queens who graced, or rather endured, my presence, there were countless women whose lives were governed by the rhythms of hearth and home, of childbirth and harvest. They held little political power, yet their resilience was the very bedrock of the kingdom. They knew hardship intimately, disease that swept through families like a cruel reaper, childbirth that was a gamble with death, and the ever-present threat of famine or plague. He gestures towards a bustling market square now appearing faintly in the misty distance. The air here carries the mingled scents of fresh produce, damp wool, and perhaps a hint of something cooking over an open fire. Their work was endless. From dawn till dusk, a woman's life was a ceaseless cycle of grinding flour, spinning wool, preparing meals, tending children, and perhaps assisting in the fields. A constant struggle against dirt, hunger, and cold. And yet there was community laughter songs sung in the evenings around a crackling fire. They found strength and shared burdens in the small intimacies of family and village life. A different kind of power, certainly, than that wielded by kings, but no less essential. He turns to you, a thoughtful expression on his face. You, in your modern age, perhaps take for granted the very comforts that were luxuries then. Warm water readily available, food abundant and varied, a lifetime free from the constant threat of pestilence or starvation. Imagine waking each morning knowing that a failed harvest could mean hunger, or a simple cough could mean the end. It put one's focus, shall we say rather sharply, on survival. You might find yourself nodding slowly a deeper appreciation for your own era dawning. My pursuit of an heir, my constant demand for a male successor also cast a long shadow on the lives of women, even beyond my own wives. Henry continues, his tone becoming more somber. It reinforced the idea that a woman's primary value lay in her ability to produce sons. My daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, brilliant and capable as they were, initially suffered the indignity of being declared illegitimate, their very existence a challenge to my desires. Imagine their burden living under the constant shadow of my dissatisfaction, their lives twisted by the whims of a king who craved what they could not immediately provide. He gestures towards a small, quiet cottage where faint light glows from within. And the men, too, the farmers, the artisans, the laborers. Their lives were bound to the land, to the seasons, to the whims of nature. My wars fought often across the Channel demanded their sons their resources, their unwavering loyalty. My taxes levied to fund these conflicts, and my opulent court weighed heavily upon them. Yet they persevered. They tilled the fields, crafted their wares, and built the very foundations of the England I ruled. He sighs, a heavy sound that seems to ripple through the very air. In their simplicity, perhaps they found a resilience that those of us in power sometimes lose. They knew the direct consequence of a bad decision, a poor harvest, a cruel lord. Their lives were unburdened by the intricate web of courtly intrigue, but bound by the very tangible realities of mud, hunger, and cold. A simpler life, perhaps, but certainly not an easier one. And yet, Henry muses, a faint smile playing on his lips, through all my proclamations, all my struggles, and even my rather unfortunate physical decline, England, in its stubborn, resilient way, continued to evolve. My reign, though often driven by personal desires and a desperate quest for an heir, inadvertently laid the groundwork for profound shifts. The consolidation of royal power, the rise of a new Protestant identity, the foundations of a naval force that would one day rule the waves. These were not always my explicit intentions, you see. Sometimes a king's actions, much like a stone dropped into a pond, create ripples far beyond his immediate sight. He gestures towards the horizon, where the first hint of dawn is now painting the sky in soft shades of gray and rose. I found myself in those final years a prisoner of my own making. My body a cumbersome cage, my court a place of polite pretense and constant fear. The very grandeur I sought to embody became a gilded burden. The endless feasting, once a joy, became a necessity for survival, a way to mask the pain that gnawed at me from within. It is a peculiar irony, would you not agree, to possess absolute power, only to be utterly powerless against the decline of one's own flesh. He turns to face you fully, his spectral form, now clearer, in the soft dawn light, his features etched with a profound, almost weary wisdom. My legacy, I believe, is a complex tapestry. It is not merely the wives, nor the break with Rome, nor even the son I so desperately sought. It is also the hidden lives, the quiet resilience of the common folk whose daily struggles were the true backbone of my kingdom. Their unyielding spirit, their ability to endure hardship and find joy in small moments, that, my friend, is a testament to England itself. He pauses, a deep, resonant sigh escaping him, a sound that seems to carry the echoes of centuries. Power, I have come to realize, is as fragile as paper when it forgets why it was folded in the first place. My quest for an heir, for stability, led me to tear down old structures to rebuild anew. But in doing so, I sometimes forgot the human cost, the quiet lives that were disrupted by my grand designs. It is a lesson learned perhaps too late. He looks at you, a soft, almost tender expression in his eyes. And so, as the sun begins to rise over this ancient land, and my memories begin to fade back into the fabric of time, I offer you this final thought. Remember not only the thunderous events, the great names, and the grand pronouncements of history. Remember also the quiet struggles, the unseen resilience, and the everyday lives that form the true enduring tapestry of any age. for in those quiet corners the most profound truths often reside. Oui, and so, dear listener, Henry's voice, now a gentle echo, seems to surround you, as if carried on the very wind that rustles through the Tudor town. You are no longer on the cobbled street, but in a space between a quiet chamber where the sounds of the bustling world softly fade. My story, I suppose, is a testament to ambition and to the inconvenient truth that even a king is but flesh and blood, and that sometimes the bravest act is simply to endure. My quest for an heir for stability led me to tear down old structures to rebuild anew, but in doing so, I sometimes forgot the human cost, the quiet lives that were disrupted by my grand designs. It is a lesson learned perhaps too late. His voice, though fading, retains a familiar dry wit. Power, I have come to realize, is as fragile as paper when it forgets why it was folded in the first place. He chuckles, a sound like dry leaves rustling. One may rule with an iron fist, but one cannot command the tides of fortune nor the stubborn refusal of a body to obey. And as for leaving a legacy, well, I aimed for monuments of marble and gold grand effigies, and a direct male line stretching to eternity. Instead, I left a rather large mark, a few rather memorable wives, and a considerable budget deficit. I often wonder now how history remembers me. He muses a hint of genuine curiosity in his tone. Is it the golden prince, the athletic youth, or the colossal figure perpetually in pain with an insatiable appetite and a rather unfortunate odor? I suspect the latter lingers more. And perhaps that is the ultimate jest. The grand pronouncements forgotten, the raw human indignities remembered. A king reduced to a cautionary tale about diet and temper. He pauses, and you feel a profound sense of quiet acceptance radiating from him. But for all the turmoil, for all the wives and the wars England endured, it found its own path, and that perhaps is the true triumph not of a king but of a people. Their resilience, their quiet strength was always the real foundation of my kingdom, far more so than any decree I ever uttered. So, my friend, Henry's voice grows softer still, intertwining with the fading sounds of the Tudor dawn. As you drift now, let these echoes settle. Remember not only the thunderous events, the great names, and the grand pronouncements of history. Remember also the quiet struggles, the unseen resilience, and the everyday lives that form the true enduring tapestry of any age. For in those quiet corners, the most profound truths often reside. The ambient sounds of the Tudor town, which had become so vivid, now recede once more, blending into the background hum of your own world. The faint scent of wood smoke gives way to the familiar air of your surroundings. And if you find yourself awake, restless, let these thoughts drift over you like the gentle mist on a Tudor morning. For in understanding the past, perhaps one can find a quieter peace in the present. The overarching narrator's voice begins soft and inviting. The complexities of King Henry VIII's life, from his vibrant youth to his challenging final years, offer a unique lens through which to view not just history, but the very nature of human experience. He was a man of immense power, yet utterly vulnerable to the frailties of the flesh and the shifting tides of fate. His reign, a grand, messy, and ultimately human drama, reminds us that even titans are bound by the simple, often undignified realities of daily life. Now, as the last echoes of his story fade, allow yourself to drift into a deep and peaceful slumber. The world of Tudor England, with all its grandeur and its grim realities, will wait until you are ready to explore again. For tonight your journey ends here, cradled in the quiet understanding that history, much like sleep, holds countless layers waiting to be gently uncovered. Rest well, dear traveler. The stories of titans in all their vivid human complexity are always here, ready to guide you to peaceful dreams. Good night.